Okay, so we are recording. Yes, so since the exam is going to have more than 40 questions, because whatever questions you get above 40 questions would be applied as extra credit, I'm going to provide a longer time for you folks to take the exam. I think it's an hour and 15 minutes, but don't quote me on that. I have to double check. Okay, so we're going to talk about altitude, which is super exciting. I was just online reading about Mount Everest again because I never get tired about reading about Mount Everest. And I found this really cool infographic. And it shows that Mount Everest is the highest mountain on Earth if it's measured from sea level. But we here on the Big Island have the tallest mountain if it's measured from the base of the mountain to the peak, and that is Mauna Kea. And then if we're measuring it from the center of the Earth to the top of the mountain, the highest mountain measured in this manner is in Ecuador, and it's Mount Chimborazo. Just a fun fact. I remember as we move to altitude, it's the decrease in barometric pressure which causes the decreased partial pressure of oxygen. It's not the actual, it's not the percentage of oxygen that's being reduced. It's the barometric pressure, right, multiplied by the percentage of oxygen in the air. And it's this decreasing barometric pressure, which is resulting in a lower partial pressure of oxygen at altitude. Okay, so last time we met, we covered the respiratory effects, the renal effects, and the metabolic effects of moving or ascending to altitude. So just as a review, as we move to altitude, the first thing that would happen is that we start to hyperventilate, or our ventilation increases. And this is a result of our chemoreceptors detecting lower oxygen content in our blood. And as a result, ventilation increases. We also have renal responses here, where in an attempt to attenuate or to slow down the increase in pH because we're hyperventilating, our kidneys secrete more bicarbonate. And remember, if we get rid or we secrete more bicarbonate, this is going to inhibit hydrogen from binding to it, and we are unable to expel this as CO2. So this is one way where we're able to conserve a hydrogen ion and delay the increase in pH. As a result of moving to or ascending to altitude, we shift a reliance on glycolysis. Because it's cold, our pH increases, which causes our oxygen dissociation curve to shift to the left, which means that we have less offloading of oxygen at the mitochondrial level. Also, since we're cold, we're vasoconstricted, which reduces the amount of blood flow to our working muscles, which means we have less delivery of oxygen and substrates to support aerobic metabolism. And this is another reason why we shift onto glycolysis as our main metabolism, or the main way we produce ATP. And another reason is because if we start to shiver, shivering uses glycogen as its fuel source. So these are the reasons why we shift our reliance onto glycolysis. And this gets into the lactate paradox, where last time I mentioned that because we shift our reliance onto glycolysis, we would expect our lactate levels to go up. But over time at altitude, our lactate levels actually decrease. And there's no explanation for this. And this is why it's called a paradox. So let's cover the cardiovascular adaptations or the cardiovascular response to altitude. So the first thing that's going to happen, right, is our plasma volume drops. So why does our plasma volume drop? Well, the increased ventilation that we are experiencing is increasing the amount of water loss or insensible water loss through our respiratory tract. So we're losing water through our respiratory tract because of our increased ventilation. Also, if we're cold, we typically don't have that sense that we need to hydrate. So in addition to increased water loss through our respiratory tract, we also have a decreased water intake. Also, if we are cold, right, we vasoconstrict. This leads to diuresis through the hormone atrial natriuretic peptide. So our plasma volume drops. As a result of our dropping plasma volume, our heart rate is going to increase at any given submaximal workload and even at rest. However, our maximal heart rate is going to be decreased. And this is related to a reduced sympathetic nervous system stimulation or responsiveness. Also, what we will see is since our maximum heart rate is decreased and our plasma volume is decreased, this is also going to decrease our maximum cardiac output because our cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume. So if our heart rate at any given level is increasing at submaximal levels, right, this is going to decrease our stroke volume according to Frank Starling's mechanism. And at the same time, if our max heart rate is reduced and our maximum stroke volume is reduced due to the plasma volume loss, the overall result is a decreased maximum cardiac output. At the same time, we also have a decreased AVO2 difference. And this is due to the decreased partial pressure of oxygen in the arteries. Because remember, the amount of oxygen that's being delivered is dependent upon partial pressure gradient differences, which we learned in the respiratory section, right? So if we recall our fixed law of diffusion, which says that the difference in the partial pressures between membranes, the larger this is, the more exchange will happen. The smaller the difference, the less exchange will happen. So we have a decreased AVO2 difference. And this explains why we have a reduced VO2 max at altitude. And depending on the altitude, the higher we go, this results in lower, or it results in a lower VO2 max or a larger drop or difference in VO2 max. On the plus side, we have an increase in red blood cell count. And this takes about 3 to 4 weeks. And this is a result of the increased erythropoietin production at the kidney. So our oxygen carrying capacity is going to be increased, but this is going to be in the face of a reduced plasma volume, which is our limiting factor here. Okay. So there's a comment. There's also a revised new altitude measurement for Everest. Does that mean there's a new, like the actual linear measurement?
Yes, they found it's a little higher, about 29 feet, I think.
Oh, wow. Huh. I wonder if that has to do with the tectonic plates or something. That's interesting.
That's right. You're correct.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Very cool. Yeah. So I don't know if you guys are reading the news. Last year, a lot of people who were trying to hike Everest were, they weren't making it because the line to climb Everest, there's only one rope. And so you are limited by the speed of the person in front of you. And there was just like a big traffic jam of people, pedestrians trying to hike, of these climbers trying to hike, and people weren't making it and they're passing away on the mountain, which is not funny, but it's like, it takes away from the novelty of it when you see photos of this. And they leave them there because it's too dangerous to move them. So, but right now it's closed to hikers because of COVID-19. Okay, so the barometric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. And you should know this number for the test and just in life in general. So anything less than 760 millimeters of mercury would indicate that you are at altitude. And the drop in this number would indicate the height of the altitude, right? So for example, Pikes Peak is about 500 millimeters of mercury, so Colorado. If you're on top of Mount Everest, it drops to 250 millimeters of mercury. So based upon the barometric pressure, you're going to be able to determine the approximate altitude of whatever that mountain is or whatever that altitude is. Okay, so what are the different altitude illnesses? So acute mountain sickness is one of the lesser illnesses, and it's not necessarily fatal, and it's characterized by headaches, throbbing of the head, just because your vasculature or your vessels in your head or your brain are vasodilated, and this is what's causing the throbbing. You can actually feel your heart rate or your heartbeat in your head. Nausea is another one. And this is going to be a result of a low ventilatory response. And not being acclimatized. Not being acclimated or acclimatized. Remember, acclimated, it's happening in an artificial environment. Or acclimatized, which occurs in the natural environment, which would really mean that you follow the recommended ascent tables, meaning you would hike up to a higher altitude, but then maybe during the night when you sleep, come down to a base camp to sleep, and following that protocol, that would enable you to become naturally acclimatized. So if you're not ventilating, so if you have a low ventilatory response, this means that you are going to become acidotic, right? Meaning, think about when we talked about ventilatory threshold, the inability to get rid of that hydrogen ion is what's causing the acidosis. So a low ventilatory response in this scenario would also cause acidosis. It's usually worse in the morning and after exercise. Have any of you folks, if you could put it in the chat box, been up to high altitude and felt the effects of acute mountain sickness? As you folks are maybe responding or typing, I'm just going to put one more thing down here. Hypoxia, which is a low arterial oxygen, right, where it's going to lead to cerebral vasodilation. And as I mentioned up here, the throbbing of the head, right? This is going to result in the sensation of feeling the throbbing in the head, but it's really your stretch pain receptors that are telling you that there's throbbing. Oh, no one has felt the effects of acute mountain sickness? It's not very pleasant. I've been onto the top of Mauna Kea at the observatories, and we just finished climbing the stairs in the observatory, and I felt like I was going to pass out. I felt nauseous, and I felt like I was going to pass out, and I wouldn't be able to work in that environment. I was obviously not acclimated or acclimatized, but it was the only thing I could think of, the only thing that I could do was focus on survival, which it felt like at that time was just to keep breathing and try to keep calm. It was not very pleasant at all. Okay, so insomnia or the Cheyne-Stokes breathing. So this is really interesting. So we talked about when we're at altitude, ventilation increases. So when we increase our ventilation, we blow off additional CO2. Do you recall when we talked about shallow water blackout and breath holding prior to diving down underwater to increase the length of time that you could hold your breath? We talked about how your ventilation is very closely tied to the levels of CO2 in your blood. So as we hyperventilate, we blow off too much CO2, and your chemoreceptors detect this. So as a result, they slow down ventilation, right? So then they slow ventilation down so much so that your breathing becomes shallow, and you have intermittent times of no breathing. So you essentially stop breathing in the night, and it's similar to sleep apnea. So it's similar to sleep apnea. So you have this intermittent hyperventilation, CO2 falls to a very low level. This is detected, so your CNS tells your respiratory muscles to stop, right? So that the CO2 levels can build up again. And so this is a period of breathing and non-breathing. And this is the Cheyne-Stokes breathing, and this is related to altitude sickness and insomnia. So the two more serious altitude illnesses are high altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, with cerebral edema being the more dangerous of the two. With pulmonary edema is related to the pulmonary vasoconstriction due to hypoxia in the blood. So hypoxia meaning low levels of oxygen in the blood. So that there's so remember we talked about how there's going to be lower partial pressures in the atmosphere of oxygen, which is going to lead to lower partial pressures of oxygen in the alveoli. And this smaller gradient, according to Fick's law of diffusion that we talked about in the pulmonary section, says that this is going to result in less perfusion of oxygen and CO2 across the membrane. So this is going to result in vasoconstriction of the pulmonary vasculature to try and to make up for this reduced oxygen and CO2 exchange across the membrane. High altitude pulmonary edema can also result in clot formation in the pulmonary circuit. But these symptoms related to high altitude pulmonary edema are most likely related to the pulmonary vasoconstriction that's happening. Right. Due to the low levels of oxygen in the atmosphere, which translates to low oxygen in the alveolar air. Wow, it must be the last week of school. I'm having a lot of trouble here. Okay, so the treatment or the response to this is descend to lower altitude. Get off that mountain. So high altitude cerebral edema is going to be more serious than pulmonary edema, but if you're at high altitude and somebody's showing symptoms of AMS, acute mountain sickness, descent is always warranted so that they won't progress, their symptoms won't progress to high altitude pulmonary edema or cerebral edema. So with cerebral edema, the symptoms of this is shortness of breath, coughing, tightness in the chest, fatigue. I'm sorry. This is the symptoms of pulmonary edema. You might have been thinking, oh, that's pulmonary. So the symptoms, shortness of breath, coughing, tightness, chest in the chest, fatigue, blue lips, or cyanosis, lips, fingernails, confusion. It's apparent that the person is not having efficient oxygen exchange at the lung. High altitude cerebral edema is going to result in the same results or the same symptoms, right? Headache, lethargy, fatigue, ataxia, and it can lead to death. So this is typically the most serious high altitude illness. The treatment for this would be descent. For all of these symptoms or these illnesses, you could give supplemental oxygen, but it's only going to be temporary, right, for the time that they are receiving supplemental oxygen. And if there's any sort of exercise or walking, the symptoms will get worse. So descent is always the recommended treatment or solution. And the cerebral edema is when your vessels become leaky, and it's leaking fluid into the interstitial space in your brain or your head. And this is what's causing the headache So you can see that this is a progression of the throbbing, the headache throbbing of the pain stretch receptors that we talked about in the acute mountain illness. Okay, so what is hypocapnia? Hypocapnia, hypo meaning low, capnia meaning CO2. So if you were to dissect hypocapnia, we're talking about low CO2 levels in the blood. So we become hypocapnic at altitude because we have an increased ventilation. As we increase our ventilation, we're blowing off additional CO2. And this blowing off of additional CO2 is what's causing the hypocapnia. In individuals who are mountaineers and they like to hike at high altitude, oftentimes they take something called Diamox or acetazolamine. And what this does is it reduces or inhibits carbonic anhydrase. So what this means is, if you recall from up here, so I'm going to copy and paste this equation down here. So if you recall, right, our hydrogen ions bind to bicarbonate to form carbonic acid, and this disassociates at the lungs where we blow off CO2. So if we inhibit carbonic anhydrase, we're going to inhibit this equation or this reaction from occurring. So if we So if we inhibit this reaction from happening, right, we cannot blow off that CO2. So what Diamox does is it slows down the alkaline environment, right? So it prevents additional loss of CO2. Right, so it's helping to prevent hypocapnia. And also remember, we talked about the renal response to ascent to altitude, where the kidneys secrete bicarbonate, where if we secrete the bicarbonate, hydrogen ions have nothing to bind to. And this is another way that we are able to slow down the increase in pH. So when we take Diamox, remember it was in the Cheyne-Stokes breathing. Remember it was the loss of CO2 that's detected by our chemoreceptors that tells our CNS to signal to our respiratory muscles to stop breathing. Right, so by taking Diamox, it's going to help us to retain more of that hydrogen ions, and so this helps to also maintain O2 levels while we sleep. Right, because it's that loss, the too much loss of CO2, which is causing us to temporarily stop breathing when we sleep. So if we are keeping our CO2 and we are able to increase our levels of CO2, we don't have that signal to slow down our breathing and to stop the breathing while we sleep. So that is how Diamox helps at altitude. So what are the differences between highlanders and lowlanders? So this is really interesting. So highlanders have a larger proportion or a larger size of the torso compared to the rest of the body. Right. So this means they also have larger heart dimensions. Their cardiac muscle mass is larger, and they also have more capillarization in the cardiac region, which means that they have a reduced, not only are they going to be more protected from hypoxia, but they have a reduced incidence of cardiovascular disease. Capillarization, that's spelled correct. Okay. They're also polycythemic. Remember, polycythemia is a hematocrit greater than 65%. Remember, what is our normal hematocrit levels? So it depends female versus male. So females, it's usually 46 to 50% hematocrit, meaning if you drew someone's blood and you spun it down and you took a linear measurement of the column of blood, and then you took a linear measurement of the hematocrit, which is the stuff that's going to be red in color, that would be about 46 to 50% of the entire blood column. In males, it's typically higher. 50 to 52% hematocrit is normal. Polycythemia is when hematocrit is greater than 65%. This is what also happens with blood doping in athletes who remove their blood, remove the red blood cells. And as a result, the body produces more red blood cells. And then before the event, they infuse back the red blood cells to become polycythemic, which is going to increase their oxygen carrying capacity. But at the same time, it also increases the blood viscosity, so increases the risk of clotting. But highlanders are polycythemic, which means that they have an increased higher oxygen carrying capacity versus lowlanders. So that they are naturally acclimatized to altitude. So when highlanders descend to lower altitudes and they stay there for a longer period of time and they become residents maybe, or maybe they are there for 2 to 3 months, their cardiac output decreases, meaning they don't retain all of these adaptations to altitude, meaning that these adaptations are moldable depending upon if they're at altitude versus low sea level or in lower altitudes. Are there any questions? Okay, how is Cheyne-Stokes breathing different from sleep apnea? So Cheyne-Stokes breathing is related to CO2 levels falling. So it's related to the chemoreceptors detecting that falling in CO2, which then creates, or which then signals to the brain to stop ventilation because we need to keep our CO2. Otherwise our blood pH increases too much, right? And we need to maintain homeostasis. Sleep apnea is usually related to obesity. And remember you folks did it in lab 1 where we measured neck circumference. And if your neck circumference is greater than the normative range, this puts you at risk of sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is usually more related to obesity and weight versus Cheyne-Stokes is related to your chemoreceptors detecting that low CO2 levels. But it does result in similar effects where you stop breathing during your sleep. But Cheyne-Stokes is related to concentrations of CO2, and then sleep apnea is more related to being overweight. Good question, thank you. Okay, are there any other questions on altitude? Because we are gonna transition into body composition. So remember, I just copied and pasted these questions from the Laulima online, the review questions. So if you're wondering where I got these questions from, that's where I got it from. Okay, so body composition. So what are the different ways we can measure body fat using underwater weighing, BIA, skin folds, and DEXA? What are the assumptions of each and how do they work? And also what are the guidelines that should be followed? So first of all of these underwater weighing, BIA, skin folds is a 2-compartment model. Right, so underwater weighing, BIA, and skin folds. 2-compartment model meaning we are separating the body into fat mass plus fat-free mass. So fat mass is fat, and then fat-free mass is everything that's not fat mass. So this is what the 2-compartment model is we're taking the body and we're breaking it down into 2 compartments. And this is the model which underwater weighing, the bod pod, BIA, and skin folds use. This 2-compartment model has assumptions. It assumes that the densities of the fat mass and fat-free mass, right, which will be the protein, the water, the mineral, so bone, because that's not fat, are additive and the same. We know this is not true. We know that in African Americans, they have a higher bone mass density. So the density of their fat-free mass is going to be higher than that of Asians, which Asians usually have lower bone densities. And this is why when we, in lab, you guys use a specific equation for that race or ethnicity. And it's meant to dampen or take into account these assumptions or to make up for these assumptions. Another assumption is that the proportion of water, mineral, and protein in fat-free mass are the same between individuals, which we also know is not true. And then also each tissue type represents a constant proportion of fat-free mass, meaning of the fat-free mass, the proportion of water is going to remain constant. The content of mineral and protein are going to remain constant in fat-free mass. So when we talk about underwater weighing, right, this uses Archimedes' principle, where the weight loss underwater is related to body volume. So using that mock data that you guys had in lab, the whole idea, right, is to determine someone's body density, because once you have someone's body density, there's those equations that you could use to plug into to determine percentage of body fat. So underwater weighing uses the loss of weight underwater to measure volume. And if we can determine that, we already know the person's mass, right? Because this is just weight on land. We can determine someone's body density. So how do we determine volume? Volume is the difference in body weight. Right? So if on the test you're given someone's weight on land and say they're 80 kilograms on land, but underwater they are, I don't know, 5 kilograms underwater, you should be able to calculate their volume. Right? This is how we determine volume, is taking someone's body weight on land and we subtract out their body weight underwater. And this difference is their volume. When you folks did the underwater weighing, we also took into account, right? So we also subtracted residual volume and the GI tract space. But in the most simplest terms, the volume of someone's body is a difference in weight from land to underwater. What is the what are the methods for this? So what are the pre-testing guidelines? Right, you guys hopefully remember this from lab. So avoid gaseous foods. It's gonna make the person lighter and it's gonna overestimate their body fat. Test females outside of their menses. Make sure you calibrate the scales. And if you did this in lab, don't round your numbers. I don't know if you folks ran into this problem, but if you round off your numbers, you would have gotten very, very different answers. So when you're doing these calculations, it's best to use a graphing calculator or Excel, because then you don't round your numbers. Also, make sure to understand the relationship of weight underwater and density. So if you have 2 different subjects and subject A weighs heavier underwater, this means that subject A is denser. And the increased density, you could make the assumption that they're going to have a reduced body fat compared to subject B. Right, so make sure to understand that those with the highest underwater weight, when matched for mass on land, are going to have a higher body density, right? Which means they're going to have less body fat. Let's see. The bod pod or air plasmography. Of course, I didn't spell that right. It's similar to underwater weighing, but instead of determining someone's body volume by determining their body weight underwater, this is using changes in volume of air within the bod pod. So this is actually measuring body volume directly without having to submerge someone completely underwater. So it uses the changes in air volume to determine body density, because this uses the same equation, right? Where now the bod pod is measuring volume directly, and we know the person's mass, which is their weight on land, so we can determine their body density. From then we can plug that into the equation for body fat to determine someone's body fat. So the bod pod, one of the biggest assumptions or guidelines for this is that the subject needs to wear a swimsuit and a swim cap and try and remove facial hair as much as possible. And the reason for this is if you were to wear bulky clothing, right, the bulky clothing is going to trap warm air between the clothing and the skin. And this air is going to become, this warmer air is going to result in a decreased body volume, meaning heating up the air is going to make it more compressible. And if you make the air more compressible, it's going to underestimate someone's body volume. So if they don't do this, it's going to underestimate body volume. So if we look at this equation, and if volume increases, what happens to this number? Oh wait, I'm sorry, I'm seeing it backwards. We decrease body volume. What happens to our density? Our density increases because our volume decreases. So as a result, it would underestimate their body fat. Does that make sense? So this is why it's important for the person to wear a swimsuit and swim cap. It's to reduce the amount of heat or warm air that's trapped between the outer layer of clothing and the skin surface. So the bod pod only takes about 20 seconds to complete. So it's an easier method than the underwater weighing. So for the DEXA uses X-rays, or actually the attenuation of X-rays, to determine density. So DEXA's not a two compartment model because it's measuring protein or bone, right? Plus fat mass. So it's usually considered a three compartment model. How this works is the X-ray is going to be sent through the person, and the level of attenuation is going to be detected by the arm, which is detecting the amount of X-ray that went through the body. So this is why it's called absorptiometry. Right, so this is dual energy absorptiometry, meaning how much of that X-ray is being absorbed. And it's that level of attenuation that's going to provide the density. Skin folds also is a two compartment model, right, where we assume that subcutaneous fat is proportionate to visceral fat, which of course we know that is not always true. So the example is in native Asians, so Asians from Asia have a higher percentage of visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat. So we know in this race, it's going to be different. This assumption is not going to hold true. So make sure to understand or know the three sites that are used for females and males. So for males, the acronym is CAT. And then for females, the acronym is TST, with thigh being the common denominator. So for males, it's chest, abdomen, and thigh. And then for females, it's tricep, suprailiac, and thigh. Also know the assumptions or the guidelines. So you want to measure skin folds with a Lang or Harpenden and make sure the caliper you use corresponds to the equations that you use, because a Harpenden provides more pressure than the Lang caliper. Also, you want to make sure that you test prior to exercise, because remember, during exercise, the water moves to the interstitial space, and this is going to cause the skin fold to be larger and overestimate body fat. BIA is another tune compartment model, bioimpedance analysis, which means that the machine sends a electrical current through the body, and the speed is going to be dependent upon water or muscle mass, because muscle is comprised of a lot of water. So the faster the current, the more muscle mass, the more impedance, or slower the current, the more fat mass. And the traditional BIA and the handheld Omrons and the Tanita scale, which is stand on, it assumes that the body is a cylinder, right? And there are segmental BIA machines, which are going to break down the body into 4 limbs and the trunk. So this model would assume the body is broken down into 5 cylinders. So if you're using a handheld Omron, right, and you're holding it in front of you like this, it's really measuring the speed of the current through your upper body. If you're using a Tanita scale that you can buy from Walmart and you're standing on the scale and your feet are on that scale, it's really measuring the electrical current through your lower body. So depending on which you use, you're either going to be measuring the percentage of body fat through the upper body versus the lower body. The traditional BIA is the one in the lecture slides, where the subject is laying supine. And if you're doing this method, you want to make sure that you lay supine for at least 10 to 15 minutes so that the water so that the water distribution is going to be the same between pre and post testing, right? Because this is dependent upon the water. And of course, if you're using BIA, you don't want to do this post-exercise where the water compartments would have been shifted. You want to make sure the person is euhydrated or normally hydrated. And if you're using the BIA or the Tanita, right, where the person is going to be tested in the upright position, make sure that they are in this posture for about 10 to 15 minutes prior to testing. And this way you can make sure that the conditions that they were tested are going to be the same. The other thing of BIA is that there are low frequency currents and high frequency currents. The low frequency currents are considered those of 1 kilohertz, and the high frequency currents are considered those 500 to 800. kilohertz. And the difference between this is that the low frequency currents only move through, extracellular water. Meaning the water outside the cells, versus the high frequency currents move through extracellular and the intracellular water. So when I'm talking about the extracellular water, this is water outside of the cells. So this is the water in the vascular space, or in our blood vessels and our veins and our arteries, and interstitial space. Intracellular water is the water within our cells. So that's the difference between low frequency and high frequency currents. And then the other method that I did not mention, I'm going to put it up here, with our circumferences. Circumferences are a really great method for determining body composition for fields and for field-based methods. You don't have the equipment if you're trying to test multiple individuals. And this is the recommended method for the obese population, just because they might not be able to submerge themselves underwater. Maybe they won't fit in the bod pod. Maybe their skin fold will not fit within the caliper for skin folds. So anthropometrics is going to be the preferred methodology for the obese population. And there are equations that will predict body fat from circumferences. And these methods assume circumferences are affected by fat mass and muscle mass, and therefore are related to fat mass and lean body mass. So essentially, for circumferences can be used to estimate body fat, and it also gives you an indication of gynoid versus android obesity. Android obesity, which is the apple shape, which is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Gynoid is the pear-shaped body, which is associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Circumferences are also going to be great. So if you're taking waist circumferences, there are cutoffs, right, that are going to dictate or going to tell you whether or not your subject or your client is at an increased risk of cardiovascular and metabolic disease. So if they are male, anything greater than 102 centimeters places them in an increased risk of cardiovascular, metabolic diseases, lifestyle diseases, and then a waist circumference greater than 88 centimeters for females. So these normative numbers you should remember. Let's jump down here. So I think that's a question here. Yeah, so this is what are the normative ranges for waist circumference? For males, it's anything greater than 102 centimeters. For females, it's anything greater than 88 centimeters. Okay, so what is the difference between fat mass and lean body mass? Fat-free mass does not contain any fat. Lean body mass contains essential fat, such as cellular membranes of your cells. So you might find in literature, or if you continue on in this field, that people use fat-free mass and lean body mass interchangeably, but they are not the same. Fat-free mass does not contain any fat versus lean body mass contains essential fat. Okay, so in obese population, what is the best way to determine body composition and stratify your cardiovascular and metabolic disease risk? It's always going to be circumferences. If you're working with an obese population, just make sure that your tape measure is the extra long one and not going to be short. If you're working with an obese population, you need to go out and look for the longer tape measures because the standard tape measures that are available may not fit around your client. And just a word of advice, if you feel like maybe the tape measure will not fit around your client, do not attempt to do it at all, just because you don't want to make your client's self-esteem or efficacy reduced, right? You don't want to demotivate them even before you start your program. Okay, so what is the equation to determine body mass index? You will definitely need to know this. BMI is equal to weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. So make sure you know this equation. This will definitely be on the test. And then what will also be on the test would be the normative ranges. So your normative ranges, actually start with underweight, would be a BMI less than 18.5 kilograms per meter squared. Normal is anything between 18.5 and 24.9 kilogram per meter squared. Overweight is 24.9 to 29.9 kilogram per meter square, and obese is anything greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared. Make sure to know these normative ranges. You will definitely, well, you may see it on the test. Okay, so what is the equation used to determine body density? This is the same one that you've learned in chemistry. Density is equal to mass divided by volume. So the methods which uses density are our underwater weighing and our BOD-POD. So these methods require you to determine the person's body density first, and then plug into the equation to determine percentage of body fat. And then we cover this. So for males, the acronym is CAT, so chest, abdomen, and thigh. For females, it's tricep, suprailiac, and thigh. What are the lowest healthy ranges of body fat for males? Anything lower than 5% would be cautionary. And then for females, 8 to 10% of body fat would also be cautionary. But remember, with every method of measuring body fat, there's going to be a standard error of the estimate. So when you guys did body composition in lab, for example, in the skin fold equation, there was this very, very long equation, right? That went on 2 or 3 lines. And then after that, you saw the acronym SEE is equal to the 2.1%. So that's the standard error of the estimate, which tells you whatever number that you get, there's going to be error associated with that number based upon the assumptions that we make early on, right? So we had assumptions for the 2-compartment model. And because of these assumptions, there's going to be an error associated with these field-based methods. And so when you do your, say you do skin folds and the body fat comes out to be, say, 9% for a female. And if you look at the equation, it'll tell you that the standard error of the estimate is, for example, 2%. So if the body fat you measure is 9, this actually means that person's body fat could be anywhere from 7% to 11%, right? Because there's a plus and minus 2% error range. So just keep this in mind when you're using this in the field. So if you measure someone's body fat, a female's body fat, and it's 8%, although that is okay, it could actually be 6%. So in these cases, make sure to really observe and to really, spend some time to evaluate your athlete's performance, their health, their outlook, right? Because there are errors associated with these methods. Although we get a number, this number is always a plus and minus something. There's always error associated because we're not directly measuring body fat. Especially in females, a very low body weight, a percentage of body fat is associated with the female athlete triad, and it's associated with 3 aspects, right? So an eating disorder, amenorrhea, so it could be irregular periods or the absence of a period. It doesn't have to be complete absence. It could just be irregular menses. And the last thing being low bone mass density or osteoporosis. Right. So if you're working with females in a sport where aesthetics is very important, such as gymnastics, diving, ballet, these sports typically, in these sports, these athletes are typically going to be at a higher risk for a female athlete triad. And we don't want these athletes to have an eating disorder that's going to affect their long-term health after their participation in a sport, right? It's not worth it to have a long-term health issue based upon maybe a 5-year competition window when they were younger. So if you're working with athletes, just pay attention to their body composition, and referring back to the previous sections about the overtraining syndrome, right? Just being able to monitor your athletes or your clients and their overall health is going to be important. But what we went over in this class and in body composition are giving you tools for you to detect changes or changes in behaviors that are resulting in changes in body composition. So just keep a holistic approach with these methods, because we know that body composition is not the end all be all of performance, right? We know that reducing body fat to the lowest amount of possible body fat does not necessarily result in a higher performance. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording.